I smile as I give John his free sandwich. He's been homeless for the last kind of 40 years and I've no idea where he sleeps, but I really enjoy the chats we have together. But then out the corner of my eye, I see Steve sitting there in this homeless centre. I'm 22 and it's my first job and I'm so excited to make a difference in the lives of people. But Steve is staring at me and I know he doesn't like me, so I just carry on chatting to John. And then Steve, who's obviously been drinking, he shouts across, "Oh, you, Derek!" And I try not to pay attention and pretend that I'm listening intently to something interesting John is saying. And then with a bit more aggression in his voice, Steve shouts, "Derek!" And I turned to him and I said, "Listen, Steve, I'm just chatting to John at the moment." And he stands up and he storms over to me, wobbling slightly as the effect of the drink is taken. And he slams his hand on the counter in front of me and he said, "I know, but I'm talking to you." I said, "Listen, Steve, you need to just calm down." And instinctively, I see his face and I know I've said the wrong thing. And he starts to swear at me as he looks at me. I was like, "Steve, you need to calm down, otherwise I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Things go from bad to worse because then he starts swearing even more and he starts raising his voice and shouting at me, and I'm feeling terrified. There's this kind of tension in the pit of my stomach and I feel like I'm going to be sick and I don't know what to do. And so I decide that I just need to play my ace card, and I said, "Steve, if you don't stop it, if you don't calm down and go and sit down, I'm going to phone the police." And with more bravery and courage than I felt, I headed over to the phone and picked it up, so he knew I was serious about it. Steve just exploded. He stormed over to me. He grabbed the phone and he threw it across the room. And he got right in my face and he spat at me. I could smell the stink of his breath. And he whispered to me so nobody else could hear. He said, "You try and phone the police again, and I'll get the knife out of my pocket." I had no idea what to do at this point. I felt white as a sheet, and so I just went and sat down. The volunteers who were helping me manage this homeless centre, they'd gone, and I was on my own with a crazy homeless guy and a few other homeless people who were intent on staying out the way of Steve. They'd obviously come across him before, and I just sat there, not knowing what to do, just hoping not to make a wrong move to make this worse. And then Steve goes and sits down as well, and he sits between me and the door. And I just sat there waiting to see his next play. And he just sat and ate a sandwich and didn't say anything. Seconds turned into minutes and he didn't do anything else, and he went back to chatting to other people, occasionally looking across at me. And I knew I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there. It wasn't a safe place to be. And if I got up, I'd already made so many mistakes that if I got up and went towards the door, I just didn't know what Steve would do. And so I just sat there quietly, occasionally speaking to other people. Minutes all kept going by. Eventually 40 minutes had been gone by. There was so much adrenaline in my system. I felt like I was going to pass out. And I was sat there and I'm like, all I'm waiting is for him to explode at me or something really bad to happen. And so I decided I'm just going to have to do it. And I mustered my last bit of courage and I got up. I thought, I'm just going to not look at him. I'm going to walk straight toward the door and I'm just going to walk straight out. And I did that. And he didn't move. And I got out and I headed home. And then at that moment, all the relief just poured out of me. And I just felt completely drained. I just felt completely empty inside. I knew that what had happened was going to mark me for years. It was going to have a massive impact on me. But in that moment, I walked home and I was like, what am I going to do now? I had this like crazy dream of making a difference in people's lives. I wanted to be warm and fuzzy. I wanted to kind of make a difference to people. I didn't want to risk my life. I didn't want to be terrorized and feel unsafe. So what was I going to do now? I mean, what was the alternative? Living a life of safety and comfort and making life easy for myself? Sorry, it's a bit cold out there, so I've come back inside for the rest of the video. So psychologists discovered two types of happiness. And this makes like a massive difference to our experience of life. And the first type of happiness they call hedonic happiness, which is this is all about the pleasure and less pain. This is about minimizing discomfort or anything that's a little bit hard or awkward for us. So you're saving a safe job. You do the easiest things on night, like watching Netflix. You avoid any risks in relationships or work. You just do what is easy and what feels good in the moment. And if we're honest with ourselves, our like instinct is like drawn towards that all the time, even in work or after work or when it comes to eating or whatever it might be. Our instinct, there's such a heavy pull towards pleasure and minimizing pain, hedonic happiness, which is really important to be aware of that. And on one level, it makes a lot of sense. Well, why would you not want to have less pain and more pleasure? Why would you not want things to be easy? I mean, who wants to be hard? But then here's the interesting thing, isn't it? That human beings, every day, human beings decide to start a family. Every day, human beings decide to start a business. And both of those things are basically an invite for years and years. In terms of the parent thing, it can be decades and decades where you're just basically inviting stress and pain and problems and discomfort and hardness. You're just opening your door of your life for all that stuff just to come pouring into your life. Same if you start a business, you're just going to commit so many hours, it might not work, and so much pain and difficulties. It's like the opposite of the hedonic happiness, the opposite of pleasure and pain, isn't it? And there's a really interesting verse right at the beginning of the Bible where it talks about God creating us, and that explains. People look at the start of the Bible and think it's all science. Actually, what the start of the Bible is not about how we were made, which is like the science thing, but more around understanding why we were made and more like understanding ourselves. And there's a really interesting verse in there in Genesis 1:28 when God says to people that he's created, he said, what I want you to do is to fill the earth. I want you to multiply and fill the earth, and I want you to reign over it. I want you to govern it and steward it and look after it and take charge of it and be the manager, steward of the world. Basically, God was saying, I want you to have purpose. Yeah, purpose in terms of family, if that's your calling and your thing, purpose in terms of working and doing things and look afting and creating and bringing forth life in all sorts of ways for society. And it's like we were created on purpose for a purpose right at the beginning there, that's like in us, which is why we might make these crazy decisions to invite stress in our lives so that we could live meaningful lives, so we can live with purpose. And psychologists kind of matched it up. So they found that the second type of happiness, hope they pronounced this right, it's eudaimonic happiness, which is linked to more about purpose and more around meaning. And this is the happiness which is not like about feeling good in the moment, but about this kind of long-term fulfillment. It's much more durable, it lasts longer, and it seems to like be experienced at a deeper level. We experience the two types of happiness almost like in different parts of our body. They feel very different, the whole kind of pleasure thing. Whereas the deeper meaning fulfillment type of thing, they're kind of opposites. And you can't have both in any individual moment. In any individual moment, you've got to choose to do the easy thing or the hard thing. You've got to choose to do what matters, or you've got to choose to experience pleasure. And in a sense, a complete life is mixed up of both of those things, isn't it? And but probably the key is to think about how do we include more purpose activities in our life. You don't have to think about including more pleasure because instinct probably always getting towards that stuff. It's maybe the meaning stuff that can get slipped by the wayside. But researchers have looked at this idea of mnemonic happiness and the impact on us. And it's just like incredible the stuff that they've found. And it matches Genesis 1 so closely, this idea that God has created us on purpose for a purpose. And that part of our design is to have purpose and meaning in our lives, that we're not just created for pleasure. And here's three things that they've discovered. So they did some research where they followed like 6,000 individuals over 14 years, and they looked at them and they had questionnaires and they examined, and they found that those that had a sense of purpose, a stronger sense of purpose, were much less likely to die. those that had a sense of purpose, 15% less chance of dying than those that were a bit aimless, that were a bit hopeless. And that applied no matter what people's age are, whether they're in their 20s or their 70s. And then they did some research with, I'll put all the links in the comments, by the way, for the research that I'm quoting today. But then they did some research about people who were facing cancer, and they put them into two groups in order to get therapy. But the therapy they got, there was very different. So one type of group got what they call support-centered therapy. So it was about support and helping people, showing them what they need to do next, asking how they were feeling. Very supportive type of therapy that they got. And then they had this second group, which was not about making them feeling better, but actually it was called a meaning-centered group. So it got people to think more spiritually, more kind of about their purpose and meaning and what they were learning from it, and how it was changing the view of themselves and their view of life, even how they could decide to live with more purpose. And the astonishing thing that they found from these two groups who were facing just terrible, terrible circumstances is that the ones that got meaning-centered support had less physical symptoms. Not only did that happen, what they found was the meaning-centered group had less physical symptoms of cancer and the related illness, that they felt less hopeless about life, that they felt that they had a higher quality of life, and they were much more likely to want to keep on living compared to the support-centered group. Which should really make us think, because you would imagine the support-centered group would make you feel better, that people are just talking about how they can support you and help you and giving you practical help to cope with it. Whereas sometimes it's a bit challenging, isn't it? I mean, if you're going through cancer and someone is like, well, what are you learning from it? What meaning are you discovering out of it? Rather than just a warm, cuddly approach. But the results are really quite startling. And then they did some research with teenage volunteers. And they got teenagers and they split into two groups. One went on a waiting list to volunteer, and the other group actually volunteered, and it was to help younger children with their homework and their classes and that sort of stuff. And this was focused really around the health of those teenagers. And when they looked at the health of the teenagers volunteering, there was like a massive difference from those that were just on the waiting list. So this was random, who got into what group. But they found that the inflammation was lower in those that volunteer, their cholesterol profiles were better, their body mass index was lower, their cardiovascular risk was lower, and just like all these massive health, very tangible health differences. And so we were created on purpose for a purpose, to kind of govern and rule and to do things to help others, to impact the world and all that sort of stuff. And psychologists have discovered when we get involved with that, that we live longer, that we can cope with suffering better, that our mental health goes up, and that actually there's physical changes in our body that reduces the risk of disease because we have purpose. And comfort is our default state. That's where we lean towards us. But it looks like comfort feels good, but isn't actually always good for us. And so for me, when I was in that situation with that homeless centre and I was at severe personal stress and risk and challenge, and I faced that decision about how was I going to live my life, and I decided to go down the purpose route. And so I got back involved working with homeless people. I got another job working with them. And then through the decades, I've done all sorts of different things that have been very costly personally, a lot of pain, a lot of sacrifice, but I've lived in this kind of purpose-focused life. And it looks like that the research backs it up. Certainly the Bible does, that that's where we were created. And so even though it's difficult, even though it's painful, even though sometimes we just want to watch telly and we just want to make life easier for ourselves, I want to encourage you not to make that your default state. And you don't even want to overwhelm yourself with lots of stuff to do, but have some sort of purpose, have some sort of meaning where you're serving others, where you're making a difference, whether that's in your work, whether that's in voluntary work, whether that's just in your relationships, that you were created for a purpose and you were created on purpose. And if you're up for that, but you're really wondering, well, what exactly could I do? What could I discover as my life's purpose? Then you want to watch this video next, because in that video, I walk you through 3 key questions that you can use in order to discover what is it you're supposed to do. You know, you want to find purpose. What might that purpose be? How could you hear God speaking to you and guiding to you with about what you are supposed to do? And I found those 3 questions, just asking those 3 questions, really helpful in finding my own sense of purpose. So yeah, watch that one next. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.